Thank you so much, Julie. And it is such a pleasure to be with all of you again. For those of you with whom I'm learning for the second time this week, it's wonderful to be back together. And for those for whom this is the first time we're learning together, it's wonderful to learn with you. And of course, Shabbat Shalom, wherever you are, Shabbat Shalom. So this week's parasha is Vayishlach. And Vayishlach is named Vayishlach because it's talking about Yaakov sending out messengers to basically figure out what the deal is going to be when he encounters his brother Esav. So if we recall last week's Parashat Vayishlach, the end of Vayishlach, there's a bit of an argument between Yaakov and Lavan, his uncle, and he ends up fleeing, and there's a wage dispute, and it's quite a lengthy narrative. And he ends up fleeing, or rather, maybe fleeing is not the right word, but he ends up journeying back to to his father's house. So he wants to go back to the land of Canaan, but in order to do so, he's going to be traversing Seir. And Seir is where Esav, his brother, lives. And if you recall from Parashat Toldot, the end of Parashat Toldot, Esav says to his father, "My brother has beguiled me twice. First, my bechorti, my birthright, and then my blessing. And when the days of mourning for my father pass, I am going to kill my brother my brother Yaakov, excuse me." So Rivka overhears this. In my class this week on Rivka, we talked a little bit about this. Rivka overhears this and says to Yaakov, "Get out of here, go to my brother and father's house and get a wife for yourself there." And so it's been 20 years that he's been living with Lavan, his uncle, and Rivka's brother. And he has quite a number of children at this point, and he has a lot of animals, and he has 4 wives. And so he's doing quite well for himself in a lot of ways. And he's now at a point of traveling back to the land of Canaan, and he is going to encounter his brother on the way. So there's an elaborate scene, and in the source sheet, I provided you all of the verses. And the rabbis read this in a variety of different ways. And I'm going to discuss them. I'm going to kind of give over the narrative a little bit more outside as opposed to us reading the verses directly. But I encourage you to look at those verses on your own, either now or at some other point. And we're going to open it up to discussion a little bit later in our learning together. So another thing I just wanted to say from the outset, this parasha also includes the very difficult, troubling, distressing, disturbing story of the rape of Dinah by Hamor and Shechem. We are not going to be discussing that today. It is a very important narrative that is getting discussed more now, but it's one of those things that we need to be very conscientious of and do a lot of work around and learn how to be a responsible reader of Torah. And to be a responsible reader of Torah means really grappling with all that Torah contains. So though we're not discussing that narrative today, there are many wonderful commentaries, and I just want to name that it is there, it is present, and it is part of what we are dealing with. And Dinah actually does get mentioned in this section of the parasha as well. So Yaakov is distressed, and he doesn't know what to expect when he encounters Esav, because of course 2 decades earlier, Esav has said, "I'm going to kill you because you have stolen from me twice." And it becomes clear to Yaakov that Esav has 400 men with him. So of course Yaakov is already totally distressed, and he's thinking, "Oh my God, my brother has 400 men with him, an army, he is going to kill me. Clearly he is going to kill me." So Yaakov says, "All right, I've got to divide my family up, because no matter what happens, I'd like at least a remnant of them to survive." And so he does so. He divides up the children with their mothers, and lots of different animals go in different locations. And there's a very elaborate process for that happening. What's interesting in that is that Yosef and Rachel, who are his favorite son and wife respectively, are in the back, meaning that they are the most likely to survive if, God forbid, there is an ambush. I just want to name that there are a lot of really troubling family dynamics here. There are troubling family dynamics throughout this entire Sefer. So we are continuing in that vein, and we'll be continuing in that vein until we complete this Sefer. So just to put that out there, we've got Yaakov dividing his family, determining which side of the river they're going to be. And at one point they go ahead and he has his famous dream of wrestling with an angel until dawn and getting his name changed from Yaakov to Yisrael, one who struggles with God. Another thing that's really interesting there is that Yisrael also can mean Yashar El, one who is upright or straight, from the Hebrew Shoresh Yud Shin Resh, from the Hebrew root Yud Shin Resh, which is very interesting because if we think about Yaakov's life in general, he's not the most morally upstanding person. We see this in multiple ways in this parasha. And so in this situation, he's got this division happening. He has sent ahead messengers, and those messengers he gives specific instruction to. And in that sending away, he is entirely trying to figure out what kind of a situation he's walking into. One imagines that over the preceding 20 years, Yaakov was really built up in his mind the sense of, my brother is going to kill me. He is this wicked person. He is a vengeful character. All of the things we don't like in a person, we project onto Esav. And so what actually happens when they encounter each other is that Yaakov has each one of his wives with their children come forward and bow to the ground 7 times. He also bows to the ground 7 times, and he prepares a tremendous gift for Esav. Esav, meanwhile, with the 400 men and all of his provisions, is thinking to himself, Avi, my brother, Achi, my brother, I have enough. I have enough. There's plenty for me. I don't need more. And Yaakov cannot hear this, it seems, and is continuing to insist, please, Achi, take this gift that I'm giving you. Please take this gift. And Esav is saying, well, I have enough. I have plenty. And finally, Esav relents. But one can imagine how uncomfortable Esav must be in this scenario. His brother is bowing down 7 times in this very self-deprecating and supplicatory manner. All of his family is doing this very choreographed thing of like, we come in peace, don't kill us, because they're going on this assumption, which is rooted in reality, right? Several parshiot ago, we're told directly by Esav that he is going to kill Yaakov. So Yaakov is terrified that that's going to befall him, and Esav runs to him, embraces him, falls on his neck, and kisses him. Now, there is a very famous midrash because in the Torah, there are 6 dots over the word kiss, and there's a very famous midrash that says that actually Esav wasn't going to kiss Yaakov. Esav was in fact going to bite Yaakov, because the rabbis are very invested in ascribing negative qualities to Esav. There is a binary throughout Bereshit when it comes to brothers and siblings, where one sibling is the one that carries forward the lineage and the other one does not. The Ramban, Moshe Nachmanides, who lived in the 12th century of the Common Era, is very known for his commentary about Esav, and Esav is connected to Edom, and there's an idea in rabbinic literature that Ma'aseh Avot Siman Labanim, Ma'aseh Avot Siman Labanim, so the actions of the fathers are a sign for the children. Meaning that things that have happened, one might think, well, Abraham was such a generous person, so too is that a siman to us, is that a sign to us that we should be generous? And, any number of the really beautiful qualities from the Avot and Imahot, we too should embody those. But a lot of rabbinic and medieval commentaries say, in fact, that everything that happens is also a portend of things that are not great that happen in the life of the Jewish people. So Esav was understood as Edom. Edom is or was a nation in the Transjordan with whom Israel had a very difficult history in the biblical period. That then gets transformed into Rome because Rome was a very brutal empire with whom the Jewish people did not fare well. Both in terms of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash in 70 of the Common Era, also with the failed revolt of Beitar, and of course the martyring of many of the Torah sages of the early rabbinic period, including very famously Rabbi Akiva. But also in the traditional Yom Kippur liturgy, there is a section during the repetition of the Musaf Amidah called the Martyrology, in which we go through the gruesome narrative of the martyring of 10 sages. And so Edom, or Esav, is assumed to be the from whom all of this negativity is descended. All of the oppression is descended from Esav. And so it's easy to kind of read back into this narrative and to say, well, in fact, Esav had bad motives. He was not genuine. He was not interested in reconciliation. He was interested in taking advantage of Yaakov again. He was interested in pulling one over Yaakov. And I want to mention that because I think it's important for us to understand how we read this narrative, because we don't read narratives in Torah, or really anywhere else, I think, with a blank slate. We bring all that we are and all that we have to those narratives. So the rabbis are very colored by their own experience. And I put that out there because as we return to the actual pshat of the text, to the actual narrative as presented in Torah, I think it's very easy to read it in a variety of different ways. So we return to Esav, and Esav, I imagine, is feeling very uncomfortable. As I said earlier, his brother is bowing down to him, the whole family's bowing down to him, he's brought his entire entourage, and Esav even asks Yaakov, well, who are all of these people? And Yaakov says, these are my family with whom God has blessed me. And he said, and Esav eventually says, well, I have plenty, my brother. I have been richly blessed by God, and I don't need for you to supplicate. In this narrative, as my teacher and friend Maharat Ruth Belinsky-Friedman taught this week, there is a power differential where Yaakov uses the term Adoni, my Lord, when referring to Esav. Esav uses the term Achi, my brother. Esav is saying, no, in fact, we are brothers. There is no power differential. We are on the same plane. I am not, you are not an Aved, and I am not your Adoni. You are not a servant. You are not to supplicate yourself. And what's interesting here is that despite Yaakov's humble posture, in the end, it's a really unfortunate ending to the story, because Esav, I think, in good faith, is like, wonderful, we've reconciled, follow me to Seir, and you'll have your holdings, I'll have my holdings. I know the family is exhausted, so I will go at your pace. So imagining the way that travel took days and weeks, I mean, that's a deeply considerate act that Esav is saying, like, I will go at your pace. I know you have all these children with you and they must be so tired. And Yaakov says, well, go on ahead. It's going to take us a little bit of time. We don't want you to wait up for us. Go on ahead. And so what ends up happening is that Yaakov actually does not follow Esav. Yaakov goes to Sukkot and builds himself a dwelling in Sukkot. He does not follow Esav. And one could imagine that Esav and his family and all of the people who are with him are like, where is that Yaakov? Wasn't Yaakov supposed to come with us? What's happening? And that sense of bewilderment and perhaps even embarrassment that Yaakov's not here. Where is he? So Yaakov, in my view, and I'm really interested in discussing this with all of you, Yaakov doesn't come out very well in this narrative. I think that there is a way in which psychologically we tend to get into these patterns where we assume that because something happened in the past, we had a really bad encounter, we kind of build it up in our mind like, oh my God, it's going to happen again. I don't know about any of you, but this is something that I certainly experience, right? If I have had a negative encounter, or I've had a negative experience, or something has gone awry, and I know I'm going to have to encounter that thing again, I'm like, oh no, it's not going to go well. All of these things are going to go wrong. And it's so easy. I can, list off all of the ways in which something is going to go wrong. It's not going to go the way I want it to go. It's going to end up badly. And so I get into that space of saying, well, inevitably, I've already written the narrative, beginning, middle, and end. have to encounter a thing, had a bad experience with the thing, it's going to go badly, guaranteed. And we get in those deep patterns of thinking of, well, definitely the way that I'm thinking about this is actually correct. And so Yaakov, with his tremendous fear, is in that space. And the fear is reasonable. I would imagine in Yaakov's position, if you genuinely believe that your brother is out to kill you, there's good reason to be very concerned about that. In no way am I suggesting that that is not a valid concern to hold on Yaakov's part. What I do think is very interesting for all of us to think about is the way in which that concern, that overwhelming fear, and the way in which he assumes that fear to be accurate and acts accordingly means that he was completely unable to imagine a different outcome. And the Torah presents us with a different outcome. Esav, by the pshat of the text, is very pleased to see his brother, comes to him, embraces him, falls on his neck and kisses him. An act of tremendous affection. I haven't seen you in 20 years. How are you? Who are these people? Who are all of these relatives of mine? Because after all, they are family. I want to know all of your children. I want to know your wives. I want to get to a sense of who you are. What have the last 20 years been like? Here are my family. Here are my children. Let's get to know one another. But Yaakov really holds Esav at arm's length entirely. And because he's adopted this posture of supplication, he's not able to connect. And in the end, he leaves Esav hanging. His family goes a different way. And we don't hear from Esav again. We get a sense at the end of the Parashat of all of Esav's clans, which that's a really interesting thing to kind of dig into, but we don't actually hear from Esav again, which I feel like is so sad because there's so much we don't know. You know, how many times do we encounter narratives in our own lives where we're like, what happened to that person? I heard about this, that, and the other thing, but I don't actually know what happened to them after that. What happened? We don't get that here. We get this cliffhanger of a narrative, and we know ultimately what happens to Esav's descendants, and we have the entire listing at the very end of the Parsha, but we don't get a backstory. We don't know who they are. We don't have that sense. And I think that it gives us a lot of interesting things to think about in terms of relationships in our own lives. Because another way that we could read this is that reconciliation does not have to mean coming back together. Yaakov and Esav could have genuinely reconciled here and could have made the decision to say, I love you, I forgive you, but you are no longer in my life and that is okay. And we mutually accept that that is the reality and we are moving forward with that reality and with the acceptance therein. So how many times in our own family struggle, right, in our own lives, do we have situations where there are family members that we are not getting along with? And maybe we are able to get to a point of reconciliation, maybe we aren't. But our tradition, I think, also tells us in this story that reconciliation does not have to automatically mean that the next step is blending. The next step is coming together. The next step is, now I'm going to hang out with you and we're going to be buddy-buddy as if nothing happened, as if our childhood never happened, as if the last 20 years never happened. But it recognizes that forgiveness and reconciliation do not have to automatically mean that a person reestablishes connection. So one could read with a bit more of a generous view of Yaakov and say, okay, they had this reconciliation, but in fact, they are not going to reestablish a relationship. There is no enmity, there is no bitterness, and there is no relationship. And there can be a sense of peace there, which I think that is also a very interesting way to read this text. And the beauty of Torah, and particularly this narrative, is that the ambiguity allows for a lot of different readings and a lot of different ways of understanding Yaakov and Esav. I also want to think about the role that family play in this narrative. So we have, of course, this entirely choreographed scene where Yaakov is having his wives and children come forward. And of course, we have Leah first, and then Zilpah, then we have Rachel last, and we have Bilhah before that. And it's interesting to think about the ways in which different choices are made around who comes first, especially in a situation when you really aren't sure if the person's going to survive. I mean, think about that. Leah being the one with the most children, but yet also the one least desired. I can imagine she's in this really weird position of saying, well, great, so I'm coming forward with my children and I'm coming forward in this way of reconciliation, but what's going to happen to me? I could be ambushed. I could be slain. What is that fear like? And Yaakov makes sure that Yosef and Rachel are last, because Yosef and Rachel, as we learn in next week's Parashat Vayishlach, are the most favored. And we also learn in next week's Parashat Vayishlach that Yosef is helping out his brothers Dan and Naphtali, but clearly there is deep hatred and enmity. And Yosef is not acting in a way that would allow one to have more charitable feelings towards him. He's kind of a jerk in next week's parsha in a lot of ways. Now, of course, the way that the brothers respond to that is extraordinarily out of proportion and deeply flawed and really troubling. And you'll explore that next week. But the way in which family dynamics just keep appearing again and again and again is such an interesting thing for us to think about, because it's easy for us to say, well, that was then and this is now. We would not behave that way towards our own family. Well, how true is that actually? How true is that actually? How often is it that we have really troubling, dysfunctional family dynamics? I mean, of course, it is very, I am not unaware of the irony that we are talking about this the week before American Thanksgiving, when a lot of times we are coming together with family, and even in this COVID reality, more of us are coming together in person. We might be thinking about these things right now in a deeper way than we have in the past, as we perhaps unite or reunite with relatives that we haven't seen. Perhaps we are uniting or reuniting with relatives with whom we have very different political views, different social views, lots of different things. And how do we navigate all of those things? And how do we make sure that we are showing up in the most integral way that we can? What does it mean to think about relationship and boundary? And what does it mean to think about power dynamics? So I want to pause us there. I think that this is one of those narratives in Torah that we can dig into and turn it as Ben Bag teaches us in Parashat Vayishlach. And I want to open it up to allow folks to offer comments and reflections. We are going to ask folks to put those into the chat today, and Julie will read those out. So again, if you have any reflections or comments, please put them in the chat and we will engage in a conversation.
Okay, so a few comments already came through in the chat, and I'll read those out loud. Nina comments that it's strange that Yaakov is a patriarch with no faith in the offering of forgiveness from Esav, and later says that this story frankly paints Yaakov as a coward, hardly an embraceable model for a patriarch, for a towering figure of faith.
Yeah, I want to actually address that. Thank you, Nina, because that is something that I've been thinking a lot about as I've been reading this parsha and preparing for this class today. Yeah, Yaakov really, he does in so many ways come off as a coward in this narrative. And it's troubling. What does it mean that one of our patriarchs is, like, the Torah is very honest with us and does not paper it over, which I think is actually one of the beautiful things about Torah. Because if we're all honest with ourselves, and I know that there are people in the United States, at least, who have been doing a lot of genealogical research and finding that they have had relatives who were enslavers and grappling with that lineage and what does that mean, and also uncovering lots of other really unsavory and frankly horrible things in their lineages. And I think that what the Torah really allows us to do in this moment is that uncovering. So we can both say, Yaakov is our patriarch, Yaakov Avinu, we are Bnei Yaakov, we are Bnei Israel, we are descended from Yaakov, and Yaakov was extremely complicated. And we are our own people. This is, I think, something that's very important. How do we both own the actions of our ancestors, while not assuming that that then makes us in some way completely and fundamentally flawed. What I think Torah really is allowing us to do here is every year grapple with this again and again and again, because every year we are different people when we read this text. We have had different experiences over the last year. We've learned a lot over the last year, and we get to approach these texts with a fresh perspective. So how we see Yaakov this year may be different than next year, and we get to do the work of saying, let me look at my own life. Have I been cowardly in ways that I really regret, in ways that I never considered? What's going on for me? What is this bringing up in me? If I'm noticing that I'm reacting strongly to Yaakov coming off as a coward, then there must be something in my own, this is how I think about it at least, there must be something going on for me that would enable me to be thinking that way. In what ways did I not act in the best way? In what ways did I deceive? In what ways did I not follow through with my commitments? And I think also the thing you mentioned about Yaakov being the patriarch, not having faith in the power of forgiveness, I think that's also very true. I mean, think about his conscience, right? Yaakov has stolen from his brother twice, the birthright and the bracha. And the birthright and the bracha both were supposed to go to him by the way in which family lineages worked. It went to the firstborn. And of course, that's not at all what happens. So Yaakov is burdened by that, one can imagine, and try to figure out, what am I supposed to do with the reality that I have created? What am I supposed to do with the reality of my own conscience and the way that I'm feeling about this? And one could imagine that that is going to then be projected onto how he responds to and relates to his brother later on. So I think that those are things that we as responsible readers of text and we as seekers, we have the opportunity now to take these texts and do our own inner work. It's easy to say Yaakov was really cowardly. I don't want to deal with this. I don't want to deal with him, but it's harder, right, for us to say, yeah, Yaakov was really cowardly. What can I learn from this? What do I not want to do? What are the things that I may have done in the past that I really don't want to repeat? And what are the ways in which I want to be part of a better world and building a better world? So that's the way that I am approaching that particular narrative. And I really appreciate that being raised.
Yeah, and as Martha says, Jacob is presented as an imperfect human being just like us. So a bunch of comments and questions have come into the chat. I'll just go in the order that they came in. So Jennifer—
Yeah, feel free to read a few at a time.
Okay, so maybe I'll do that and then you can glean from the comments. Jennifer says, Yaakov says to Esav that he'll meet him at Seir, but he goes to Shechem. Yaakov talks nice to Esav as Shechem, son of Hamor, talks sweetly to Dinah. Is the rape of Dinah meant to be a parallel commentary on the destructive aspect of Yaakov's treatment of Esav? Yoshua comments, I really appreciate your giving us holy permission to leave relationships that are bygones as bygones, even with family members. And Carol says, and I'll end with this comment, and then we'll go back to you, Rabbi. I find it troubling that Yaakov assumes that after all this time, Esav would be the same person he was before Yaakov fled. Hasn't Yaakov changed? Why would he not give Esav the same right to have moved on and changed?
Yeah, I'm actually going to start, Carol, with your comments, and I love all of the comments that we've heard so far. Thank you for bringing those in and keep them coming. Right, why is it that Yaakov assumes that Esav is frozen in time, that he hasn't changed? Well, again, I don't want to be reductionist, but I often think, okay, so if Yaakov is assuming that Esav has not changed, well, what's going on for him? Is he aware that he himself, because he knows it's been 20 years, he's got, at least 13 children. The Midrash says that in fact a lot of Yaakov's sons had twin sisters. So, but be that as it may, the shot of the text says that there are 13 children, and he's amassed all kinds of wealth and just a lot going on for him. So why would Esav not have done the same? Why would Esav still be the character or the brother that he knew? You know, and that again really invites us into figuring out what's going on for Yaakov, and I would say on a psycho-spiritual level. And that is the kind of exploration that I think we can all engage in one way or another. We cannot know what is going on for Yaakov simply because we just do not have that insight, unfortunately. But what we can do is maybe ask the question of ourselves. Have I ever been in a situation where I assume that because somebody acted one way at one time that they're inevitably going to act that way again? And what does that say about where I am in my own journey? And are there ways in which I have felt that about myself, that because I acted one way in one particular time, that would inevitably happen again? So I encourage us to really be thinking about that in terms of ways of doing our own spiritual work, even as we are thinking about these paradigmatic relationship stories as part of that. And to the question of Shechem and the rape of Dinah. You know, I had never thought about the rape of Dinah as a parallel story to the Esav and Yaakov re-encounter. And in that particular narrative, in the rape of Dinah, both Dinah and Yaakov are silent, but again, Dinah's silence is seen as punishing, or put another way, there's stigma, which again, I think we need to really lift up, that in the rape of Dinah, we have one line about Dinah, that she went out to visit the daughters of the land, and we don't hear from her again. We hear about Shechem, we hear about how Shechem spoke, about how he speaks very sweetly to Dinah. We don't know what she's thinking. And we know that Yaakov's upset because Shimon and Levi destroy the city after the men are circumcised. But again, we don't know how Dinah's thinking. I can only imagine, what is it like for Dinah to have a father like Yaakov in this moment? And also, there's so much we don't know. It's really easy to kind of come to conclusions of like, Yaakov is a coward, right? Here we go again, you know, but it's much harder to be like, what's going on? There's so many layers of the family dynamic. And we also don't hear Dinah's voice. I want to know what's going on for Dinah. I want to hear her. I want to get a sense of her interiority. And as my teacher, Rabbi Viva Richman, actually taught this morning, there is danger sometimes in filling in the gaps of the Dinah narrative, even though there are those textual gaps, because, and as I understand it, and this is my perspective, because there's so much we don't know, and yet when we are engaging responsibly in Torah study, and as modern people who are aware of the scourge of sexual violence, there is that desire to ask for a sense of Dinah's voice. And so I think that as we think about those narratives in conversation with one another, the way that I perceive it is both of them tell us a lot about Yaakov and give us insight into behaviors that we may choose to not adopt. And I don't think that the Torah here is saying that Yaakov is inherently a bad character. I don't think the Torah is interested in that. I think the Torah is trying to present us with nuanced perspective, and because we are engaging in narrative that is action-oriented, we are receiving an ability to understand those stories in our own experience because they're presented in lots of different ambiguous ways that allow for multitudes of reading.
Thank you. Can I read another few comments? And
Please.
Okay, great. So Joy says, Jacob is still being disingenuous when he tells Esav to leave before him and that he'll join him later because he has to go at a slower pace. He really has no intention of joining Esav.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Tanya says, the problem between the two of them begins in utero. Jacob, the grabber of the heel, according to Midrash, would grab Esav's heel to keep it from crushing his skull. Another factor that would cause mistrust is Esav was a hunter. He knew how to set a trap. He could trap people with his words. So he had very valid reasons to mistrust him. Stephen says, I was impressed in Genesis 34:13 that the word deceitful was used to describe the actions of all of Jacob's sons with respect to Shechem and Hamor. That means that the characteristic of being deceitful is passed down one more generation to all the sons of Israel, i.e. all 12 tribes.
Yes, that is really striking about Shechem and Hamor. And, you know, it's a lot to take in. And I think that we need to be very careful that Maseh Avot Siman Labanim, because like what I was saying about Yaakov, right? We as a people, these are our biblical ancestors. And there are lots of different ways of understanding that. If you are more of a traditional bent, then they really do give us spiritual gifts, and they give us a lot of lessons that we take forward in every generation. And at the same time, we as a Jewish people believe deeply in free will, that God does not predetermine or predestine the course of our lives, and that though we share a lot with our parents and with our ancestors, that does not mean that we will inevitably act as they did. So I think it's really important for us as responsible readers of text to both be able to encounter our ancestors again and again and again, and to remember that, like, simply because actions were taken in the past does not mean that we have this fundamental character flaw. So we have to sit with both of those. Our tradition really urges us to grapple with paradox all of the time, that one does not negate the other. We can be highly critical of Yaakov in this moment. We can also say, here are things we don't want to do. We can also say, and we are building a better world. And what does it mean for us? The Torah, as one of our commenters said earlier, presents Yaakov as a complex person, just like we are. Because none of us are saints. We've all acted in ways that we really don't like. When we actually take an opportunity to do some deep reflection, we have all acted in ways at some point in our lives that we deeply regret. And I believe that that's what's happening here, is that we are being reminded that that is true now, and it has always been true, to hold all of those paradoxical things together as we grapple with this text.
Wendy points out that there must have been some sort of reconciliation between Yaakov and Esav because they bury Yitzchak together.
Yes, that's a really important point. Yes, we are told at the end of this parasha that they do bury Esav, they bury Yitzchak, which I think is a really interesting parallel to Yishmael and Yitzchak burying Abraham together. So yes, I would agree with you, Wendy. There must have been some kind of reconciliation.
Okay, so a lot of comments. There was a conversation here about a few things, about Jacob being a hunter, who believes a leopard never changes its spots. This is from Karen.
Mm-hmm.
Joy says it's difficult for our memories to imagine change. We tend to remember people and circumstances as they were.
Yes, absolutely.
I lost the thread of this one, but there was a conversation about a reaction. Tanya says David reacted the same way when Tamar was raped. I don't know what that was referencing, the same way as who, but Bimaya says, and Aaron as well, after his sons were struck dead in the Mishkan.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's interesting too. I'm wondering if you're thinking about Amnon and the rape of Tamar I think it's in Samuel. I don't remember if it's first or second. I'm pretty sure it's second Samuel. Yeah, that it's an interesting parallel there to draw.
Anne says, I think it can be easy to say, looking back on it as someone not personally involved with this particular interaction, that surely it should be easy for Yaakov if he were truly faithful to trust in God so much that he doesn't feel the need to take any precautions with Esav and to take his forgiveness at face value. But I think in practice, anyone would be hard pressed to actually do so in the moment. One can have faith and not act on it 100% of the time, especially when it comes to family dynamics.
Absolutely. And I'll close with that, right? That one of the threads that we really are experiencing together this morning or this afternoon is that, in fact, conditioning is really deep and really real, and I don't think we could just wave a baton or wave a magic wand and say, I'm going to approach this interaction totally differently now, as if nothing ever happened, especially when it comes to family, because that's the most intimate connection we have. So we have to have a lot of Rahmanis, a lot of compassion for ourselves, and a lot of compassion for Yaakov, and a lot of compassion for Esav. We weren't there. This is a spiritual lesson to us. It's a paradigm. And we are inherently filtering it through the lens of our own experience. So I want to leave us with that, just as we journey forward, to really recall that there's just a lot that we don't know, and that's okay.